E agora, então, seguimos convidando para a sua palestra o professor Thomas Heller. The floor is all yours.
Hello, bom dia. I'm going to apologize for three things in the beginning of my remarks. The first is, most importantly, I'm going to speak in English, hopefully slowly, but I have stayed here, worked here in Brazil, had the pleasure of being here a number of times in my life, but I will not impose my portuñol quebrado on you, so we'll try in English. The second, I'm happy to take questions in Portuguese, assuming we have time. The second apology is that I see that they have advertised my qualifications as a Nobel Prize winner. I'm very proud of that, but of course many of you will realize that the prize was given to the International Panel on Climate Change, and of which I was one of the leaders for 10 years. And that community of scientists, economists worked brilliantly together to establish important things that I will talk about today, but it is in climate. And so I understand that from the standpoint of many of the industrialists gathered here, climate may not be the direct concern, and you have many experts here in solid waste, energy questions, and I won't try to add to what they are saying. I do notice that next year, the CNI will sponsor a meeting similar to this on climate change, so perhaps you can think of me as kind of a warm-up band before the main singer comes on next year. I will start the music a little bit with regard to climate change, but the way I will talk about it is essentially about the future of energy and the future of agriculture. And I think that the logic of what I'm going to say pertains to many of the sustainability questions that you will be considering in more specific form as we go through the day. So I'll apologize to you for that. As a final word of introduction, I'll just say that I am the executive director of a relatively young, less than 5 years old, kind of a consultancy, mostly consultancy to governments on problems of energy and land use, the two principal sources of climate emissions and climate risk. We do have offices around the world. Most of the people are in the emerging markets, and we have an office here in Gávea associated with PUC, Rio, the Universidade Católica do Rio. Many of these people know much more about the local situation than I do, and they are available under the name the Núcleo de Estudos Avançados do PUC, but Climate Policy Initiative as well. And I strongly recommend their director, Julio Assunção, who is professor at PUC in Economia, is a remarkably intelligent young economist who has taught me a lot, and not just about Brazil. And perhaps we'll get to some of their work toward the end of this presentation if we have time. So, all of that was by way of introduction, get you used to my English a bit, and especially for the translators, I hope this is coming relatively smoothly. So let me begin. The first thing I would say is that the story I'm going to tell you about sustainability and climate change, which is perhaps the most systemic aspect of sustainability, is a very challenging story. We've been trying to deal with this problem for more than 20 years now, since the first Rio Earth Summit and the first attempts to create an international treaty. And of course, 2 years ago, we had again here in Rio, the Rio +20. And it's certainly a challenging story in the sense that the economics have been relatively clear if you simply take this as a matter of economic theory, because of the risks associated with increasing climate change. It's been fairly clear that if you think about this simply as a broad economic story, it makes sense to try and control the risk through some sort of an insurance process. It's been that way for more than 20 years now. The science is pretty much the same as it was 20 years ago, but has become clarified as scientists have learned more about particular mechanisms of climate change. And indeed, the story that we have been telling about how we should deal with these scientific risks through economic policies that we have designed at the international level is a pretty simple story. So on all grounds, science, politics, economics, this seemed like kind of an easy victory, but it hasn't been. As we all know, sitting in the room, and I'll simply flash up the work of the latest IPCC groups about where emissions are at the present time, where they are headed. You can see they are up in that top chart, the band of probabilities that takes you toward 1,000 parts per million of pollutants in terms of potential changes, as well as scientists can predict these things. It could be as much as 6, 7 degrees centigrade on the average, different in different parts of the world. And the political story that we have always told is down at the bottom, which is 2 degrees is the place where you have a 50% chance of avoiding substantial damages. So it's fairly easy for climate skeptics either to say this isn't happening, or this is a problem that we can't manage. It's simply too hard for us to manage it politically, so we have to be resigned to living in a very different world unless the science is wrong. I don't think that's true. I think a lot has happened, and I'm going to try and talk about what has happened and what can still happen. But I also want to stress that it is not an easy path forward, and I'm going to try and tell you a more complex story than we have told since 1992 about how it's going to happen. And if I had to summarize kind of my whole approach to these problems and how I think you should be looking at them, it's that in the past period of industrialization, we have in many ways had tremendous successes around the world. I'll show you some figures later about how much economic growth there has been, how many people in the North and the South have been given better lives by the results of our industrialization. But at the same time, the same successful processes of growth have created challenges, as in many ways their waste products, their byproducts, their side effects have changed the very physical context in which we live, the air, the oceans, the earth. And these challenges are now becoming, as we grow more, stronger, they accumulate over time, and they are more and more serious. On the other hand, these same processes of growth, of development, have given us new capacities to innovate, to manage our world differently, to satisfy our needs through different patterns of technology and organization. And in a strange way, you can think of this as a kind of a race between the damage we are doing as a side effect of our growth and the new capacities that we have developed, about which I'll talk, which can, in some ways, mitigate, control, reduce these risks. At the same time, they generate the growth that we need. So that's the overall sense. It's really a story of how quickly we develop our capacities against the speed with which the challenges that we have created through our own activity can be managed. And that's a somewhat different story because the place of politics and the place of economics within this race are different than the simple story that I think we have been telling ourselves since Rio in 1992. And maybe that we continue to tell ourselves looking ahead to Lima this year and Paris next year, where we will try to continue to work out that story, although in my view, I don't think it's the main act of the play. I think the main act of the play now is in the economy and not in the politics. And everything I'll say from now on is trying to explain and illustrate that more complex story that I am trying to tell you. So here are the happier sides of what is often seen as a dismal and a defeating set of circumstances. The first story, and by the way, I will say that some of this will be done quite soon in a new substantial report called the New Climate Economy, which is a kind of a second Stern report for those of you who saw the work of Lord Nicholas Stern 10 years ago now. There is a second report coming out, the New Climate Economy. I think it has a lot of relevance and study to Brazil. It will be launched at the United Nations for the Climate Summit in September 23rd, and my small organization did the finance and investment work for that. And it's a more complicated story, but the story is laid out there in some greater detail. So, what's the good news in all of this? The first piece of good news, I think, is that policy, which reduces climate risk, does work. There has been a lot of it, but in many ways, its effects have been hidden, have been obscured by the very substantial growth that we have seen, especially in Asia, but in the emerging world. And that growth has increased demand for energy. And many of the countries where the demand growth has been the fastest are countries that have run their energy systems on coal. And so the consequence of this unexpectedly rapid growth from the perspective of 20 years ago has been a substantial rise in emissions that is part of what has to be a good story. I spend a lot of my life working in China. When I started there in 1989, it was a poor country. There are now 600 million middle-class people. No one can say that this is not a success, but the impact of fueling that growth, largely through coal, has changed the world's picture of whether we are succeeding or failing. So one, policy does work, but it's hidden. Number two, there is room for doing more with policy of the type we have become used to. Reason for doing more than we have done so far. Before we have to think of kind of tearing apart our energy systems and our agriculture systems and rebuilding them on a structurally changed, innovation-driven basis. So we don't have to sit around and wait. There is more that we can do. But, and here's the third story, in order to really control risk down in these lower areas, you do have to think about structural change. In the segments of the economy, which include many in which you people work, that are running on models of energy-intensive and resource-intensive growth that will become, for economic reasons, not for political reasons, not because somebody passes a treaty, but for economic reasons, the dynamics of these sectors are changing. And that change, the future, in a sense, is inevitable. The question is how much damage we do in going there. Okay? The sources of these change are already visible when we look around. And let me just give you a few words from the New Climate Economy Report to exemplify what I'm saying. Beyond climate policy, innovation across economies around new network or information technologies will drive energy and transport and agricultural applications to lower costs, increase quality, especially environmental quality, sustainability features, and facilitate finance for a transition toward a low-carbon world. Economic growth and system-wide innovation are reinforcing one another. The innovation is the source of growth, but the growth creates a political atmosphere that is better able to tolerate disruption. Okay? I come from Silicon Valley. When California is growing fast, people lose their jobs. Companies go out of business, but new jobs are there. And so the disruption does not cause the same kind of crisis, the same kind of atmosphere as when there is not growth. And secondly, growth provides budgets. It provides capital, both in the public sector for infrastructure and in the private sector, because the single largest driver of financial behavior are the expectations for growth in the future that drives investors. You see this very clearly when you do econometric studies. What pushes private capital is the sense that there is a bright future in which returns are assured and the upside return is substantial. They'll take risks as long as there is a high upside return. Without growth, that becomes very difficult. So growth becomes an essential part of this story, and the way growth occurs in this model, thinking about the economics of growth a bit differently, is that the principal source of growth is innovation, but the innovation-driven or the technology-driven growth is usually both a sequential and a long process. What do I mean by that? It's sequential in the sense that it responds to problems that have existed in the prior ways we produce. Okay? In this case, I would argue that one of those drivers to our economic model is the need to deal with resources that are becoming more expensive, and therefore you seek resource productivity as a way of both powering growth and responding to a problem that the economy is facing. But in addition to presenting problems, innovation, the main source of growth, depends very much on the state of science. Historically, this was not true. Historically, we innovated slowly by tinkering with problems presented and engineers, in effect. Although they often didn't call themselves engineers, they called themselves inventors or just bricolage, if we are in French. They would work with solutions over time. Now things have shifted so that the world is driven by science on the one hand and a series of economic problems to which it is responding on the other. And my suggestion is that we see both of these now. The science is in information science, in material science, and in bioengineering, where enormous changes are happening in the way we think about chemistry, the way we think about the difference between organic and inorganic chemistry, and most importantly, in the way we can use big data, control systems, networks, social and productive networks, to reorganize the scope of how we think about problems, as well as how we relate to each other. These changes are positive. But change is generally slow at the systemic level because technology by itself is never successful in changing the way we produce. You need to change systems, as many of you know extremely well within your own businesses. What has to change? Business models have to change. Finance has to change. Institutions and policy have to change because these all grew up in the shape that we know them in a different set of technologies, a different set of problems. And so, as human beings, we are not really perfectionists. We deal with problems as they come up and face us. The problems usually come up because of the way we solved some different problem the last time we made structural changes. And it's a difficult issue for systems to decide, for governments to decide, for businesses to decide. How do I make my strategic bet? Do I bet on this new world coming fast, or do I bet on the new world coming slowly? And I will try and make my fortune, if you will, or my political career in the world that I choose. I think in the long run, the underlying economics and science work out. But in the short run, there are a series of strategic questions that have to be answered. And I think this is a tough one for economics as well. I've taught economics at Stanford for most of my life. And the hard part is, when you are inside a system that is working well, your main concern is trying to seek more efficiency within that system. Static efficiency, we would call it, short term. But when historical cycles bring you to the point where science and new presenting problems become the principal drivers, then our standard economics do not work anymore, because we are talking about nonlinear situations that can't be modeled in the standard terms. We cannot assume that deviations, changes in the way we do things, are costs anymore. They're not necessarily costs. They may be investments in a completely differently organized economy. And so economics has to change, business has to change, and I think the main message that I want to leave you with, if there is a single message, is that right now the presenting problems and the science are showing us there are new sources of growth that have the impact of increasing resource productivity and reducing the risks that are always going to be there when you are consuming resources in the way that we have in the past. So there is not a constraint between growth at a nonlinear form and environment, to the extent that environmental risk represents the way in which we have used resources to this point. Now, that means where should we be focusing? We should be focusing on how we produce food and how we produce fuel, or how we consume fuel and how we consume food, if you will. Because these are the real sources of climate. Climate is nothing more than the byproduct of these two, climate risk, of these two industrial modes of production. We have to move in more explicit terms from extensive to intensive forms of production, and we have to understand that the way we have been producing in the past will be inefficient in the future. The incentives are wrongly situated in our institutions to take you as business people or the policymakers with whom I work, or even the economists with whom I share a profession, in the right direction. So sustainability, to the extent we understand this as increasing the productivity with which we use our resources, and thereby manage the byproducts of those resources, the negative byproducts that are changing our world, sustainability is not the margin any longer of a world that has very low resource prices. It is the core economic problem of a world where resource prices are rising, but the scientific capabilities of dealing with that through information technology, materials science, bioengineering are growing very rapidly as well. So that's my basic hypothesis, and let me now turn to some more specific ways to try and see the logic or the arguments that I have just tried to put in front of you. What it implies to me is that the way we have been thinking about climate is inadequate, because it begins in an attitude that I would call policy first, or politics first. And we have done that almost since we started. Back in 1992, we thought about climate risk as a newly discovered environmental risk, and we felt that this risk, if we managed it, would be constraining our economic growth. So what did we think we had to do? We had to create a specialized set of climate-centric politics to manage climate risk. Meaning, we had to internalize the costs, to use economic jargon, for this problem. We had to induce, in some way, new innovations in the energy area, for example, to deal with this risk better. But especially, we had to create new instruments and new institutions specifically aimed at managing climate risk. And we tried to do that from 1992 on, and I will say something about it. I think what we have to do is shift the frame now away from politics, although they have worked to some degree, as my happy story would have will describe. But I think that we have to focus more and more on what I would call the real economy. Okay, the underlying economic processes that will change the way in which we produce food and fuel, or use food and fuel as intermediate products in many of your industries. And I think that we have to understand that in order to do this, you face a number of challenges. You can't change technology without changing the systems architecture. So it's difficult because it's going to be disruptive. Secondly, it is not driven by cooperation. Okay? We don't have to all get in the room with a bunch of diplomats and have 200 countries reach agreement. It'll be driven by competition, because those who get there first will reap the rewards, and those who go more slowly will find themselves gradually priced out of the markets in which they hope that their enterprises or their polities, their countries, will go forward. It is not an easy or a comforting story. For example, there will be major disruptions in labor markets around the world. I just suggest this is the price and the very nature of economic growth that will lift us out of the current dilemmas that we find and regenerate the growth which around the world has become slow. I want to come back to that question of low growth in just a little while. Again, my final introductory remark before I turn to some slides is that I don't think this is a question of will this new future happen. I think it's a question of the pace, the speed, and the scale where it happens. And I think most of these new economics we are looking at tells us it is somewhat indeterminate which countries or which industries or which firms will go first. It's a strategic question that is faced. We cannot give an answer, this is precisely how it will happen. But it will be driven by normal behavior, competitive markets, forming coalitions with other actors with whom you are engaged, having the proper policy or system changes and financial arrangements that can finance what are often capital-intensive processes in their early histories. So it's an uncertain future, it's a strategic future, but it's one which is critical to us because the race I described is a question of how fast we change and how widely we change in terms of how much damage we do continuing to produce in the systems to which we have become accustomed. So, some slides. The macro story. Where do emissions come from at the macroeconomic level? They come from two sources, right? Economic growth drives emissions. The second source is the relative price of fuels. Economic growth in Brazil drives emissions less than it does in China because the relative price of hydroelectricity and the price of coal are quite different in Brazil and China. The United States is not facing major political pressure now on climate because the relative price of natural gas has shifted. Comparison with coal. No one will build coal in the United States anymore. Not because of policy, but because of unconventional coal, unconventional gas and oil. So relative price matters, but the main driver is growth. And so what we have seen is substantial emissions growth in the developed world between 1960, 1980, when we had heavy growth of the post-war recoveries. Then we had substantial declines in the former Soviet Union when their economies collapsed. And since 1990, the principal driver in the world has been growth in the emerging markets that I showed you with this little animation. So, at the macro story, at the macro level, the story of climate change is the real economy. Growth, relative prices. What about at the political level? What have we faced in that regard? If I can. So, I just want to point out to you here, there's a lot of stuff up there to read, too much for anybody. I just want to point out that the world in 1992, when we had the first Rio Earth Summit, and the world in 2012 at Rio +20 were completely different. the world was stood on its head. Growth and optimism about growth had been in the developed countries in 1992. By 2012, growth was overwhelmingly in the developing world. Capital, which is necessary for change, had shifted its position. Geopolitics had changed. What was the G7 was the G20. This still goes on. The World Bank exists. Now we have a new BRICS bank that will start next year in Shanghai. Capital has shifted its location. Emissions were overwhelmingly in the first world. Over the past 20 years, they have become concentrated in Asia, mainly. So the world has changed fundamentally over these past 20 years, and yet our political model of responding to it has not changed. Part of the difficulty in the international negotiations has been the underlying shift in the real economy of the world and the financial economy of the world, but not much change at the political level. So, this thing seems to be, there we go. What was the world that we imagined politically? And in a way still imagine as we approach the Paris negotiations. We imagine the world that has the features of this simple economist story. Carbon pollution, greenhouse gases were an inclusive public good. They happened everywhere in the world, didn't matter where, so everybody had to be part of the solution. What were we going to do? We were going to figure out the optimal amount of pollution, defined by the point at which the damages from carbon just equaled the the damages avoided, I should say, what you save in damage if you restrict carbon, were equal at the margin to the cost to your economy if you took those policies. So it was a cost-benefit structure. We were going to try and reach that optimal amount of pollution through a series of prices or by assigning property rights, which is what we ultimately tried to do, permissions to permit up to that optimal level to countries around the world. We have never been able to do it. We thought that we would create a global trading market in these emissions rights. Of course, that hasn't happened. And you can see the remainder of the structures there. We were going to drive innovation through this price, which we thought was going to be rising. We were going to have a legal regime to make all of this enforceable. Because of the difference between poor and rich countries, which were extreme in the 1990s, when growth hadn't really started in the way that it did in the subsequent 20 years, we thought that we would have a series of different obligations between the rich and the poor countries, and very importantly, that the rich countries would transfer resources, financial and technological, to the poorer countries. And that this process of transferring resources would be compensation for the different starting points. Now, you can see that this is still the logic of what will happen next year in Paris. And it will not work. It won't work because there is a changed world, as well as the difficulties of negotiating things like international transfers. In fact, the way almost every negotiation since Copenhagen in 2009, Cancun in 2010, one after another, the way they ended was the developed countries promised another type of transfer, which has never been funded. And how that series of unfunded liabilities will be managed in Paris is beyond me. What do I think will happen? To be very short, I think countries will make pledges that record or put down on paper the actions they are already taking at a national level and the projections that they make of those national actions. They will pledge what they are already doing. And at the same time, they will come up with some diplomatic maneuver about how to postpone the question of the resource transfers. Because, particularly given the financial crisis, those resources are not going to be forthcoming at any scale. So, we find ourselves in a situation in which, in some ways, the international political process has run down. Thank you. What about at the national level? Here the situation is much more promising. Okay, I will simply, because we're here in Brazil, indicate how much Brazil has done for national reasons, because there has been no international compulsion, and certainly not international payment, resource transfers for this. But a huge amount has happened. Why is that? I think to understand this, you go back into the makeup of the energy system and the agricultural system. And you begin to understand that what has driven energy everywhere since the beginning of modern electricity as the principal form of energy, and oil as the principal fuel for transportation, has been a series of scientific discoveries in both electromagnetism as a theory in the late 19th century and petrochemistry as a theory. And then a slow process of working out at the national level the application of those scientific theories. What we have done in most of the world, not Brazil, because of its relative price situation among different fuels, but in most of the world we have turned to fossil fuels. And we have done that by building a technologically adequate system that involves central power stations that moved power generated from fossil fuels, that had high variable costs, relatively lower fixed costs, according to demand, that it received signals through a network. It predicted that demand, and it could dispatch or move the energy up or down by adding or subtracting fuel. And so you had a nice one-way standardized set of technologies that could use coal, oil, natural gas as the principal variable cost. Brazil and the Nordic countries, Sweden, Norway, because of their enormous hydro resources, developed a somewhat different system, but notice it was always dispatchable. Could always change in response to demand because you had lagos, you had reservoirs. So you could alter the flow of hydroelectric power. And it fit together with the same system. A low carbon, what drove that system? One is efficiency. Two, security, reliability. Three, there were policies about access, differential costs to the poor and the wealthy that were always important. Four, local pollution. Five, industrial policy, trade, if you will. And these factors together, before we knew about climate risk, created national energy systems that were essentially monopolies administered by the state, usually through state enterprises, and financed by the state. That began to change in 1990 for two reasons. One, the monopolies were perceived as inefficient. So we began a process of deregulation and demonopolization of the energy systems throughout the world. with different speeds. And two, we began to understand there was a non-local pollutant, carbon, that was going to change the policy makeup of the energy system. What has happened since? Basically, a series of countries made different decisions about their willingness to pay for carbon. But what really drove their low carbon or their renewable policies were the fact that it improved security by diversifying the economy. It removed local pollution. In the case of China, which has been very active, it basically was a trade position because they sought to supply Europe with wind and solar modules, which they now find they have overcapacity and have to use at home, so they begin to improve their home carbon position through subsidies. But the main point I want to make is that carbon has been a minor feature of the actual policies that have driven the energy system. It has not been the principal driver to this point. And the way this has happened has been through local circumstances and local measures. Some countries used feed-in tariffs to increase revenues. The United States and Europe, to some degree, split the market, saying there had to be certain percentages of renewables. Other countries have used various forms of financial instruments. Here in Brazil, where you have a national development bank, debt was made available at what arguably are below market costs that subsidize these structures. The same happened in China, where you have development banking. And so we have specifically driven changes that have one overwhelmingly common feature. One, on the side of this graph that suggests that efficiency, growth, would be increased by taking certain measures, particularly in industry. Those measures have often been taken. But they're driven by efficiency. They're driven by the normal economic prospects. In the middle of that graph, where you see some towers begin to rise, but the additional cost of taking those measures is not high, we find that countries have been willing to pay, not necessarily for carbon, but for the security features, the industrial policy features of cleaner energy. But at the far side of the graph, where the costs of cleaner energy become much higher than the current situation, very few have acted, and have usually acted for very specific purposes. France is a good example. France built a nuclear system because she lost her oil in Algeria and felt a tremendous security problem, and so paid very high costs. Some places perhaps have serious air pollution problems that they felt they couldn't handle otherwise. I think that was the main driver in California of taking these measures. So what am I saying? I am saying carbon to this point has not driven changes toward lower carbon energies. It has been associated features. And indeed, some of those features are changing. If I can, well, won't worry about that. Here are renewable prices and price spreads. Look at the bottom. Technological change is occurring that are lowering the spreads between renewables and other forms of fossil-driven energy. That will have an impact. How far? I'll come back to in my final remarks in a moment. Other things, if we look a bit further here, this is China. I don't know how many of you have been there in the past years. The air pollution in Beijing is intolerable. Okay? I'm not sure what they'll do about it, but something will happen because of the very specific conditions that we are starting to see there. Some people think, particularly in the United States, that the presence of increasing climate damages will be what drives us past the past practice of being willing to pay a little more, but not a lot more, for cleaner energy that does not produce greenhouse gas emissions. What's my bottom line on this? I don't think that the damage function, that is to say the prospect of increasing damages, is very likely to determine things, because on the whole, we still don't know exactly where those storms or those problems are likely to strike. And when they do strike, usually government picks up the cost of rebuilding. That is not a set of incentives that will increase change. Will air pollution, urban problems like congestion, cause us to build different cities? People always talk about Curitiba as the example. I don't see it. I think you will deal with air pollution the way we have always dealt with air pollution, by putting specific filters on the bottom of the pipe, or moving the coal power to the west of China and transmitting it by wire to the areas that are centered with air pollution. What about the technology spreads? There, I think it becomes interesting. We start to see innovation bringing down costs. And I think there we have two ways that things could happen. The biggest problem preventing us from going forward from the current situation, which is a little bit of low carbon power in the margins of a system that is designed for fossil, is the cost to the overall system of moving to deep penetration. Because you may have to redo the system completely, in its business organization, in its finance, in its institutions. And countries are afraid of that, because it's disruptive, and it's risky, and it's capital intensive in a time when they are poor. On the other hand, some people believe that the cost of solar at the distributed level, so you don't need central action. All you have are people buying solar for their house and having electric power cars that use storage batteries or particular storage units, will cause so many people to leave the electricity system that the system will collapse and it will have to be rebuilt. We actually see something like this going on in India to some degree, because industries like yours are paying such high tariffs, because the poor pay nothing for power, that the industries are leaving the system, building their own wind or solar on the backs of their own balance sheets that they can finance because it's cheaper. There are lots of particular stories like this. Will any of them become general? So my final remarks in this story: what will make or break us in the climate world is the pace at which these changes go on. And I think that pace will fundamentally not be a question of policy, but of the underlying economics of energy. And if I had time, which I don't, I would talk about the underlying economics of agriculture in Brazil, because I think that the network and the power it has to adjust demand, not through our playing around with light switches, but machines talking to machines, receiving real-time price signals, power flowing in two directions, not just from the central station to consumers, but from all of your factories and your homes back into the system. Batteries that will increase the capacity to, in effect, manage some of your own electricity and power much more efficiently. All of these changes are on their way, not because of particular changes in the energy system, but because of exogenous changes in the economy that are driving these scientific activities and gradually extending their use into area after area. If I were to talk about agriculture in Brazil, as I love to do, perhaps in other audiences, I would say the same thing. The value of Brazilian agriculture can be 5 times what it is without ever touching another tree. It depends on turning cattle pasturage, which is overdone and inefficient, into cropping patterns. And it depends on productivity increases that are upstream, where you are growing and irrigating plants by using the network to control the efficiency of how you feed them and water them. This will come in a short time. And the downstream activities of processing, providing credit, providing risk management, providing infrastructure, which you need for modern agriculture. All of this can expand Brazilian productivity enormously. Will it happen? That depends on a series of policy changes, business models, and I'd prefer to let my colleague Giuliano talk with you about that in another context. In the end, what do I think are the things we really have to take away as the lessons we've learned so far from trying to use politics, which work relatively well at the national level, less well at the international level, but might not carry us all the way? Let me just finish with my lessons. 1, it's development first, okay? To have protection, you must have production first. If production fails, you lose the precondition for dealing with protection of natural resources. 2, I always talk in the United States about a Canadian ice hockey player named Wayne Gretzky, a very great one. Here, I don't know if I should talk after the Copa, but let me say Lionel Messi, to shift the sports analogy. He never worries about where he is. He worries about where the ball is going to be. That's his greatness. He's focused on the future, not focused on the way things are now as constraints. The future is the network, and I think one has to rethink the business in those terms. 3rd, you anticipate the market with policy. You think where it's going to be, and you begin to build the system that can improve the pace, the speed of conversion, and the scale of conversion. 4, a man who used to run one of the American oil companies always said, the hard stuff is the soft stuff. What he meant by that was, the technology is easy. It's the finance, it's the business model, it's the policy that's hard. It's the system architecture that determines the pace and the speed, not the technology. 5th, when you think about a future which is uncertain, which this future is, if I'm managing capital where I've spent most of my life, I value liquidity. I value liquidity because it gives me flexibility in dealing with changes that I can't predict. Natural capital is one of Brazil's major forms of liquidity. It's not committed. It can be done, changed into various things. Once you urbanize or remove natural capital, it's gone. It's financial capital, it's manufacturing capital, but natural capital has a special value in a world where liquidity matters. 6, in the future, it will always take a combination of public authority, policy has to change, but it will be private delivery. Embrapa is not the same as Bunge in their capacity to develop agriculture. I know both. Not the same thing. 7th, it's politics as usual. No one's going to come down and pass some policy from above, Paris or elsewhere, that will change your businesses. But the innovation and the competition and the coalitions that we are facing will. And finally, my last remark, this change is coming. We can create a lot of damage while it comes, and countries can assume different places in the industries that will be there in the future. But the main thing I would say is what one of my colleagues at Stanford talks about in the way they are now treating cancer. They always tried to figure out just how to put chemotherapy on a particular cancer or radiation and to stop it that way. They've stopped with that now. What they're doing is they are simply encouraging the body's immune system to fight it. And then they will deal with the disruptive effects of the fact that our own immune systems can create dangers for us. It's disruption. So my last remark is, if we're really going to solve climate, we have to take our foot off the brake. We have to face this disruption. We have to face the future. We understand that it will not be simple, but we understand that it's the only way we can both grow our economy and manage the changes that we, through our success, have produced thus far. Thank you. You're going to put one on. Okay.
Agradecemos ao professor Heller por sua apresentação e participação neste evento. Ele agora irá atender 3 perguntas dos participantes da plateia. Pedimos a eles, então, que façam suas perguntas pelo microfone. O primeiro deles, então, será André Saraiva, da Abine. A pergunta pode ser formulada em português ou em inglês, uma vez que dispomos do serviço de tradução simultânea. Senhor André Saraiva.
Ok.
Pedimos, por gentileza, que se posicione de pé. Já tem o microfone em mãos. Somos todos ouvidos.
Ok. Dr. Thomas Heller, prazer em revê-lo após a Rio+20. Gostaria de perguntar ao senhor se poderia sugerir 3 ações voltadas para a sustentabilidade, sendo uma econômica, uma social e uma ambiental, que podem mudar de forma significativa a vida dos brasileiros no curto e no médio prazo.
If you will allow me, thank you for... Está bem?
Perfect.
If you'll allow me, you asked for one economic, one social, and one environmental. So let me do that from the agricultural side of Brazil's life, not because of the people in the room, but because I think Brazil has the opportunity, given its enormous power and influence in the agricultural world, which is one of the major sources of carbon sequestration and carbon use, to be the global leader and to influence the world much more broadly with its behavior. Economically, I think the most important thing for Brazil to do would be to think about how to do what you already did once earlier in the sugarcane area by taking land that has already been cleared of forest, already had its carbon released to the atmosphere, so in the Cerrado. But in Mato Grosso do Sul, for example, in the past, as Brazil moved from low productivity cattle to high value sugarcane, it came up with systems of land rental and various types of forms of cooperatives that let large companies that possess the capacity to make use of capital and knowledge that only can be done through economies of scale to come into the landscape. But the critical thing is and was, they came into the landscape in a way that dealt with the social problem because the benefits that they received went back to the community, both in the form of rentals and in the form of the increasing productivity of smallholders
if I had more time, or if we post on the internet the full set of slides that I have, you can just see the incredible productivity growth that took place. The same thing has to happen in the Center West, in Mato Grosso, in Pará, because the land is not in its proper use. How to do this involves some wonderful technologies, databases, how to identify the lands, how to create institutions that can create this double issue. One, to induce more capital and intensive agriculture, but two, to make sure that you have social growth and social stability, which from the standpoint of an investor is just risk. Social risk, legal risk with regard to land tenure. And there are a lot of people in the North who do not want to sell their land. They also don't want to be farmers. That's very clear. They like being people who have fazendas. Okay. The social trick is how to satisfy their goals of their culture and their lack of trust for capital markets, so the land is their only bank, but meanwhile convert it to much higher value uses for their income and for Brazil's and the world's well-being. Last thing I would say is, I think that there are very interesting ways in which, at the environmental level, the Código Florestal, that currently produces a series of very, very fragmented forests in the private lands, or indeed natural capital protection in the private lands. Most of Brazil's forest, of course, is in public land. And some of the work by my colleagues have shown that nearly all the forests that were saved through policy are on public lands, not on private lands yet. But shifting to the CAR, to the forest land, to the Código Florestal, I think it could be done much more efficiently. You might use markets, you might use planning structures, but much more careful identification of what really are the valuable natural capital assets that Brazil or the municipios or the estados want to protect, and building instruments, policy instruments, that will be much more efficient because of their scale and enforceability than the current system is, would be my answer to something that is environmental, to go along with the productivity value of a shifted economy and the social value of making sure that communities, in a variety of ways, share in that economic benefit.
Moving on now to the second of the three questions I have for you. A segunda, então, das três perguntas que temos. A próxima será formulada por Suênia Cordeiro, do SEBRAE.
Mr. Thomas, é um grande prazer ouvi-lo, ouvir as suas experiências. E, neste momento, eu solicitaria a sua opinião de como os brasileiros podem fazer para inserir, para colocar os pequenos negócios do país na agenda de sustentabilidade. E qual a sua opinião sobre a importância dos pequenos negócios nessa agenda?
Obrigado. Uma pergunta difícil. Small businesses and households, distributed forms of production and consumption, are always the most difficult in structural change. Too often, we have had structural changes that were in some way unstable for the large entities that had the scale to use and acquire capital, and we've left behind small businesses or households from the transformations that have occurred. I'm actually quite hopeful that the changing nature of networks, which, if you think about it, and I'm reaching for my mobile here, okay, in a way, when I say you can see the future, and you can see it in your own hand, this is a form of distributed technology which has relatively low capital requirements. And those capital requirements are themselves distributed, meaning they can be supplied by households themselves or small businesses themselves. So we find many small businesses, I'll shift the market into agriculture, and I'll tell you why in just a second for a moment, but the story is always told of cocoa farmers in West Africa, in Ghana, who never got much money for what they were doing because they never knew the price in Europe at which the intermediaries were selling the crop. Now, you know the price just like that. I think that much of the impact of this new information revolution will be to distribute capacity, because it involves not just putting people cheaply into the network, as we already see, but because the other part of this revolution is essentially the addition of artificial intelligence to our natural intelligence. And what this means is we can turn over certain functions that in the past might have proven behavioral barriers for us. So in households, we don't want to constantly be looking at how hot it is or how cold it is and adjusting the heating. We don't want to be waking up in the middle of the night to turn on the washing machine because power costs less in the middle of the night. So we're inefficient. But machines don't sleep. And we can have those machines learn to do the things that we want them to do and bring down the costs of distributed solutions. So my sense is this is a good period for going forward in a double sense. I think technology will open to households and small businesses more opportunities that were there in the future, but, and I want to be clear about this, I think many of the economies of scale that we have in front of us are economies that will still be beneficial to large-scale aggregators of capital and firms like yours with specialized knowledge. I don't think scale will disappear. And so we have to think very, very carefully about new forms of industrial organization in which these scale services can be delivered to clusters of smaller operators who are in some way in local networks with the large-scale operators who are there. Smallholders will never use derivative contracts to manage their risks. Smallholders who are sharing in derivative contracts in the same weather areas with larger firms who can afford that specialized knowledge are in a different position.
And your final question now. Seguiremos então com a próxima, que será a última. E seguiremos então com a próxima, que será a última pergunta, encaminhada ao professor Heller, que virá de Carlos Silva, da Abrelp.
Dr. Heller, bom dia. Parabéns pela apresentação e obrigado por dividir conosco um pouco dessa sua experiência nesse tema tão presente hoje em dia em todas as agendas. Nós temos atualmente vários códigos, leis e diretrizes a cumprir nessa questão ambiental e de sustentabilidade, mas o déficit ainda é muito grande e aumenta a cada dia, principalmente nas economias emergentes. A minha pergunta com a experiência que o senhor tem, como sensibilizar e estimular os setores a fazerem a transposição das teorias ambientais, desse conhecimento que nós temos, para a prática, principalmente num cenário econômico desfavorável, em que os esforços e os recursos são direcionados a outras prioridades.
Yeah, I said it won't be easy. I just said it would be inevitable that it would occur. But I think the question of how you change the speed, the pace, as I called it, and the scale is a function of organization, just like the organizations that are here in this room. But in my experience in the past almost 5 years since I stopped being a professor and started to run this business, the most scarce resource in any organization, whether it's a public organization like the government or a private organization like the firms in this room, or even an industrial association like the Confédération, the most scarce resource is coordinating capacity. Sometimes, you could describe this as entrepreneurial capacity, because it's always spare capacity. Okay? We tend always to use up the capacity that we design, sometimes productively, sometimes unproductively. But we rarely keep spare capacity around. For some years in the last 2005, 2006, 2007, I spent a lot of time working in McKinsey. And the secret of McKinsey's business was they always had spare capacity. They are specialists in taking that spare capacity and assigning it to what we might call disruptive behavior, helping people to understand what are the set of changes that are necessary, and even more important, helping them to implement those changes. Because organizations don't have spare capacity, and governments are 1,000 times worse than private organizations in having this spare capacity. So if I were to say what is my prime concern for an organization like mine, I used to think it was analysis, and I hope we do good analysis. But even more, I think it is providing a kind of an agency that can help organizations when they face change, which is always a peak load problem, and helping to coordinate between a series of organizations whose cooperation is necessary, public and private, but who lack the spare capacity in themselves to do that. So I think the biggest problems are organizational. We often know what to do, but we don't know how to get there. And since that takes real activity, design, coordination, troubleshooting, all of which depend on spare capacity, I am not advising others to go out there, you who are working in firms in particular, to do that, but to recognize the variability of demand for entrepreneurial services or coordinating services, which becomes very high in times of transition. And whether it's through the Confédération, or by contracting relationships, or by encouraging the government, whichever government you have in the next months, to think specifically about organizations that are capable of handling peak load problems associated with transition is a very strong part of what I would advise.
Well, Professor Heller, with no further questions, we would like to thank you so much for having taken the time to join us in this event. Nossos agradecimentos, então, Professor Heller.